afternoon. My name's Michael Kendrick, and I'm with the Center for Public Representation. And tonight we're going to look at supported decision-making. How many of you have had some contact with it before? Okay, well, then you're going to have to answer all the questions. I'm counting on you. So, the topic of supported decision-making is not one that people might necessarily have had much contact with. It's a term that sounds like a lot of other things. So what we'll try to do tonight is make it a little bit clear what it is, what it isn't. But principally, the interest that people have had in supported decision-making in recent times has been because of the desire really to avoid guardianship and to support people with their decisions, but allow them to keep their rights. Whereas guardianship has a big downside, even if it does some good, but the big downside is the person no longer has rights, and someone else, the guardian, has the authority to make decisions for the person. So a lot of people have been interested in a different kind of balance. And so the idea of supported decision-making is essentially an organized way to assist an individual with the areas of decision-making that individual has difficulty with. And we all have difficulties with certain kinds of decisions, and we all, of course, turn to lots of different people to help us with those decisions. So this is really a practice that's quite typical for most people. And in the case of supported decision-making, it's a little bit more formal than we might in everyday life, or at least it might start out a bit formal, but it really, once you get into the practice, it stops being particularly formal. But it has been targeted at various vulnerable groups. One would be, of course, in the case of people with disabilities of various kinds. Another would be elderly people that are having difficulties with decision-making due to whatever advanced age or other limitations they might have. People with mental illness, and so on. So lots of different groups may have experience with, at some point or another, with supported decision-making. And it's a practice that can be done pretty much in a very informal, low-key way, because it's really just helping people as they're trying to make some decisions. And typically it'll mean for people that they will probably get better at decisions and decision-making, but not so good as to be great at decision-making, because none of us are necessarily all that great at decision-making. So they can't have the bar too high, or otherwise we're all in trouble on decision-making. So what I'll try to do is kind of go through the PowerPoint with you and the points on that, so that it has some explanation. But we also have some other resources for you. We have some series of articles that we'll give you the link to. And also, I've prepared a set of resources to get you started. You can kind of look at them when you get home or whatever. And these are just the beginning of getting you in touch with the resources, because there's a lot more resources than people are normally aware of. Okay, let me see if I can, I'm using a different system here.
Can you slide it towards you?
Okay, well, supported decision-making, people often use the initials SDM just because it's shorter. Is really an organized way to assist people with their decision-making. But it isn't that people are supported by people they don't want supporting them. So the key thing in all this is the supporter picks their supporters. And the supporter, if you like, can unpick them as well if they didn't turn out too well. So both things are possible. And so that leaves the person in the driver's seat. And they will pick different supporters typically for different areas of decision making, depending on what the supporter's good at. So if you're going to make an expensive purchase on something, you wanted somebody who was pretty good with money, you talk to somebody about that. But if you were trying to work out, what you should do and for your summer holiday, that might be a very different kind of decision. You might go to a quite different person because of it. So, so the individual designs the people that are going to be in their life. It could just be one or two people. It could be a large number of people. There's no upper limit. It's just really people that the person's likely to go to. And that can change over time because the issues you were worried about a year or two ago might not be what's on your mind now, so you might end up with slightly different supporters because you want people that are supporting you with the current things you're struggling with in your life. Now, many people may have people like that already in their life that they use as a supporter, and so in that sense it would simply be an extension of those relationships. But they could also even be new people that you've not engaged with at all before. So everything from very familiar people that you already have a relationship with to people that you may simply, the person may decide they'd like to try. Now, supported decision-making is different from substituted decision-making. Now, substituted decision-making is when somebody else is deciding for you. And that's, of course, what guardianship constitutes, a form of substituted decision-making, whether it's partial guardianship or plenary guardianship. It's really a person that's going to make the decisions for you. Interestingly enough, the guardianship laws typically say that the guardian should make the least amount of decisions possible and leave the rest to the person. Typically, that's the guidance. But of course, it doesn't work out that way. That the guardians may do that, but people would look to a guardian to make all kinds of decisions that the person could possibly make for themselves. The people that might get picked to be substitute decision makers could be anybody. Typically it is somebody known to the person, but there are such things as guardians that are appointed by the courts who never knew the person before, what they often call a public guardian, and they might not have much of a relationship. In fact, in many jurisdictions, they only have to meet the person once a year. So it's not exactly a close relationship, but they do have the authority to make the decisions. So, but these informal relationships could be imposed on the person by a guardian. So in that sense, the whole point of substitute decision making is the presumption that the person can't make decisions and someone will have to make the decisions for them. And again, that in the idea of plenary guardianship, that is all decisions the person may make may essentially get made by a guardian. Now, there are different degrees of guardianship in this sense, or different types of it. You do have sort of classic guardians, or conservators, they're often called in some places. Representative payee would be a sort of partial type guardianship around money matters. Persons with the power of attorney may be a substitute decision maker, but typically only when the person is unable to make a decision. And you can organize that in advance, almost like with an advance directive. And you can have the same arrangement in healthcare, that in the event that you can't make a decision, you've designated somebody in advance that will make the decisions for you. And typically there's not just that person, but an alternative if that person can't be found or immediately can't be accessed. So that's substituted decision making. And a good thing about guardianship is that should the person be unable to make a decision, when you do have guardianship, it's clear the person has the authority to make the decision. However, you may be in instances where you can't reach a guardian, such as in an auto accident or something, so somebody will have to essentially manage that situation without knowing really who to contact. And it may take some time to sort out who is the designated guardian and so on. And of course that means that puts other people in a position where they're having to make decisions with no legitimacy as to having the consent of the person. But the idea of guardianship then is it does give the people that are making those kinds of decisions permission, in a sense, to proceed based on what the guardian has said. So in this sense, guardianship is very helpful for resolving their difficulty, which is the difficulty of who's given me permission to act, in that situation. Well, a couple of has a life of its own.
Do you know what I can do? Do you want me to? Do you want me to do this part for you? You can just tell me to go on to the next one.
Well, I think you do better.
I'm maybe not better, but at least take that part out of your
I don't think I should give up my day job. Okay, so some of the drawbacks with substituted decision making are, of course, that you lose your rights. Sometimes people call this civil death. You're not really even a citizen. You're just a person without rights. So, and the person becomes a ward, somebody that is essentially decided for, and that could be on any dimension of the person's life, potentially. It doesn't mean that all guardians do it that way. So the lots of guardians work on the principle that if the person can make the decision, they'll respect it typically and that sort of thing. So they use their authority quite carefully and leave the person in the driver's seat as much as possible. But still the person has no legal right to make decisions for themselves at that point. And it's interesting how many people with disabilities, when they talk about themselves, they say, well, I am my own guardian, which is an interesting phrase, really, that I'm my own guardian, which, of course, most people are their own guardian, but we wouldn't think of it that way. And this could extend into anything. It could be health issues, money issues, lots of things. But all of this it means that you're beholden to somebody else's judgment on all kinds of things. And so the numbers of people in the United States that are under guardianship is actually not known. All we have is estimates, because there isn't a kind of universal way to keep track of how many guardianships there are, because it's often done at the state level. And we've got, of course, 50 states and territories, so each one's got their own system for keeping their information. But people are not estimating, it could be as high as 3 million, or as low as 1.5 million. But it's a lot of people, one way or the other. And this is just simply thinking of persons who are intellectually disabled or developmentally disabled. If you add in other groups, the numbers would go up. Also, people, when they don't get to make decisions, don't get to grow. They don't get to learn. They don't get to, in many ways, expand their horizons, because they no longer have the authority to do so many things. And so their true capabilities may not really be revealed because they're shielded from decisions. And it's very interesting with people that have realized that they can be their own voice and speak with their own voice, how many find that quite appealing. That they have their own way in the world and they can make things happen. And but when you don't have that, you are essentially dependent on others. And others that may be making your decisions may not be making the decisions you want or would prefer. So in that sense, the decisions about you may reflect somebody else's priorities or values or interests rather than your own. And all you got to think about is when you were young and your parents did make decisions for you, were you 100% satisfied with those decisions, or did you chafe a little bit at their poor judgment, really?
Yeah.
Just like they were thinking about your poor judgment, probably. So, it's true, as kind of a good thing about being 2018 is that people with disabilities, life expectancy has increased dramatically. But one downside of it is that that a lot of people with disabilities may go into old age, if you like, whereas that issue wouldn't have come up. They might not have lived that long at another period in history. And that may make them even more essentially prone to be placed under guardianship should their functioning be impaired with age. And we don't really know how that's going to turn out. So even people that didn't have guardianship earlier might have a higher risk as they get into their older years in life. And we'll just have to see whether that's going to happen. But now, these corporate guardianships are essentially for people that don't have people in their life to be a guardian. And so the state essentially creates some kind of formal mechanism to have people named as guardian who may be complete strangers to the person. But from the point of view of the state, that there's someone who will protect or look out for a vulnerable person. So it's well-intentioned, but in effect, you have a stranger in your life that's making a lot of these decisions. In some cases, some of these people may be paid guardians and charged for their time and so on. So it may not come from the person, it may come from other sources like public monies. But it can also be situations. There was one in the New York Times over the weekend of a woman who was placed under guardianship. And people charged, were appointed as guardians and charged, and it came out of her resources. So the presumption of legal capacity then is it's a term that many people might not encounter very often, but a presumption of legal capacity means the capacity to act and decide for yourself. And that has a certain legal meaning. It means that you have not lost the right to make decisions for yourself. And unless it's proved otherwise, there is a presumption of competence to make decisions. So legal capacities means that you really aren't going to be questioned about your right to make a decision. You might be questioned about the sensibleness of a particular decision, but your right to make a decision about whatever it is, buy a car, sign a contract, anything, rent something, all of those are acts that you're presumed to be able to do, unless there's something that has come up that says you aren't. But all of that is avoided when you of course, get guardianship. You no longer are presumed to have legal capacity. And most people won't necessarily encounter that because they'll go through life and people may not like their decisions or whatever, but most people wouldn't question that they have the right to make those decisions. Whereas there would be classes of people that are not necessarily presumed to have legal capacity. And they're at risk of then others being appointed to make decisions for them. Typically in probate courts and places like that. Now, in terms of the studies of the National Core Indicators, this is a long-term study coordinated by the Human Services Research Institute on sort of the factors in the lives of people with disabilities, different dimensions of people's lives. In a probabilistic sense, if you're people under guardianship are less likely to live in their own homes or apartments, so they will be probably in somebody else's place, a service or somebody else's. Being involved in making choices about their lives will be less likely. Less likely to have their rights respected. Less likely to have community jobs or service plans with this goal. In other words, they're less likely to be seen to work and are more isolated. They're less likely to have friends, which of course makes us all more vulnerable when we don't have friends and allies. Now, people have tried to reform this by finding some ground that's less restrictive for people. To do that, they've intervened with other measures that support people but aren't as total in their influence. For instance, advanced health care directives, durable powers of attorney for financial matters, special trusts, and advancing supported decision-making was one of those things. So all of those things are ways in which you're getting support, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, but they are a layer of protection around people. And what we found is that supported decision-making combined with these things covers most of the bases. You have enough authority to do pretty much what you need to do. But the reality is that many people don't realize they have those options, and so wouldn't seek them out because nobody's told them that these things could be helpful. But when you have them all, it can be quite helpful because you have a lot of bases covered in terms of if you do have to make some decisions. Now, the terms self-determination, control, and autonomy are very important words because they're very highly associated with well-being. People who have and are treated as if they have autonomy tend to be happier than people for whom other people are always essentially interfering with their autonomy. And self-determination and control, how many of you would find that you like to be in control?
Absolutely, yeah.
People are pretty fond of being in control of things. Not that they necessarily do good things with control, but they like control, and they generally prefer it. So the benefits then, if people with disabilities are allowed to escape all this, people having control of them, is that they get the benefits that other people have of autonomy, self-determination, and to some extent self-control, because it's also an aspect of control. And where you do have decisions to be made, you can go to whoever and get their input into your decision. So you have both the benefits of support without any control by others in the process of getting support. How many of you have ignored advice? And perhaps to your regret later, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but at least you're in the position where you could seek advice if you wanted it, or, you know, or you could reject it, you know, if it wasn't persuasive. In the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, they developed something that's a bit like supported decision making in Canada. It was called the use of representation agreements. But they're really essentially agreements where you're allowing others to help you with decisions or even to make decisions. So in this sense, the Canadians have had a form of support decision making since probably about 30 years now in Canada. Whereas our introduction of support decision making here in the United States is a little bit much later than that. So in North America, that's where the most work has gone on. It's initially in the Canadian provinces, not all of them. And there's some differences between provinces, the same as there is differences here in the US. Subsequently, in the international sphere, there was the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that called for the limiting of guardianship and for the introduction of supported decision making, or sort of endorsed it. In the process, many countries ratified the convention. And so it had a basis in the treaty, so that an international treaty. The United States never signed that treaty. The United States doesn't sign that many treaties. Doesn't like treaties, apparently. But a huge number of countries in the world had no problem with it. And what that has led to then is, at the international level, there's quite a lot of activity in many countries now on supported decision making that wasn't happening really. The convention really gave it a big push forward. So since then we've seen considerable interest, because the governments that did sign on to it had, in a sense, committed themselves to finding support or making support available to people that needed it when it came to decision making. So it created a burden or an obligation on the government to make sure that people with disabilities, in this case, had support and supported decision making available to them. In the United States, we've had some states already that have passed legislation to support decision making. Here in Massachusetts, we have an effort underway to get some legislation passed in Massachusetts. There's a group that's been developing a draft legislation and for supported decision making. And we have states that have passed it or came very close to it. For instance, Texas, Delaware, Wisconsin, Tennessee almost made it, and then at the last minute it kind of fell through. But Alaska has a law on supported decision making. And the advantage of that is that it really means then that the practice has a kind of legitimacy in law, and it can then fit with other ways that governments could assist people. So in that sense, it's a part of the system rather than just something that's informal. Many groups have endorsed supported decision making. For instance, the American Bar Association has, the American Civil Liberties Union has, the National Guardianship Association has, the National ARC has. So you're running out of groups that haven't endorsed it, because every time I turn around, some other group has said, oh, it's a good thing, we should do more of it. So it's not, it's still early days. There's considerable intellectual support for it from groups that have studied supported decision-making, guardianship, and things like this, and have recommended it to various groups. The other thing that we now have is we've got lots of people that have had practice with supported decision making. For instance, in Massachusetts, we've had 6 pilot projects on supported decision making in recent years. And we'll have a 7th one coming up soon, but not with disabled people, but with elderly people. So, and some states have also projects, for instance, with people with mental illness or other similar types of conditions. So what we have is now actual people doing something with supported decision making. And it wouldn't be very hard to go online and find examples of videos of people who have been involved in supported decision making telling their story. We just made 4 videos in Georgia, just of some people who've been practicing supported decision making. What this means for a lot of people is it's becoming real, because they can see it play out in individual lives. And of course, can talk to people that have practiced it, talk to their family. So it just makes what is an abstract concept now very embodied in real lives. And you can almost even see a kind of before and after effect. A very interesting example here in Massachusetts was a man by the name of Corey, who had been under guardianship. His mother was his guardian, and but she became very interested in this pilot project on supported decision making some years back, and sort of well into it. He started doing much better with decision making once he had support, so she could see that it had a good effect on him, which she was very pleased with. But it made her question whether he even needed guardianship because he was doing so well. But she made a decision many years earlier, and she was still mulling it over. But at a certain point, she thought, well, we should go back and get the guardianship overturned, which she did. I was there in court when it happened, but by then, you see, she had kind of worked it through her own mind that this was okay to do this. This was the right time, and she didn't have any regrets about overturning the guardianship. But so her story, her journey, is a story of going that direction. Whereas at another time in her life, she'd gone in a very different direction and felt comfortable with that direction at the time. But what changed it for her was that she thought her son was doing so much better under supported decision making than he had under guardianship. So she felt good about it, but I think partly because he felt good about it and it had a good effect on him. So that's the advantage of seeing it in practice. It either persuades you or it doesn't persuade you. And that's the nice thing about individual stories. And of course, you'll find other people who've been practicing supported decision making that may not be quite as dramatic as that, but they might still be improving, but still have shortcomings around certain kinds of decisions. So it's not always that the outcomes are dramatic, but you will have a sense of people having grown or moved along in terms of their competencies and things like that. So all of us create our own supported decision making by simply reaching out to other people. So the practice is actually there anyways. If you want to look at it, you can look at anybody's life and you'll find times when people go to people with a decision they're trying to make. If you're trying to buy a car, for instance, who would you go to? You'd go to somebody that knew something about cars. And if you're trying to work out what to wear into a particular event, you'd go to somebody who hopefully had good taste, and you trusted their judgment, and so on. Or if you're having difficulty with a relationship, you might go to somebody that you think, well, this person would be good at supporting me on that kind of question. So anything could be a reason to turn to others for support. You don't need a supported decision-making project to do that or anything. People would just normally do it. So in that sense, we've been living with the benefits of that all our lives without noticing it as supported decision-making. But you can see that we've all been benefited by having good mentors or advisors or good friends that help us get through a decision that's kind of complicated and what to do. Now, in the disability field, we often call that natural support. And again, when we call it natural, it just means that it's not formal. It's just sort of built into how we live, and it seems natural to do it. But it's very powerful because people with, in other studies, people that are socially isolated are much more vulnerable. Life is much, much harder for you if you have nobody to call on in life and you're alone a lot. Everything is harder. And just having people walk with you through the struggles of life it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot easier than doing it alone. So again, support decision-making simply capitalizes on something that's well understood by social scientists, which would be social support. Now, you can combine informal supports or natural supports with formal supports. For instance, you can talk to your friends about how to stay on your budget, but you can also go to an accountant or a financial planner. And you might rely on both at the same time. So in this case, opting for support decision making doesn't mean you give up any of the other options. You still have those options if you want them. So in that sense, formal support and informal support can be blended. There may also be resources that you can get that aren't really coming from people at the time, but maybe formal supports through way of videos and handbooks and guides and things like that that we all would use at one time or another. So you have a mix of things that can be helpful when you have to make decisions. Now, as we said, you don't always need a guardian for these sorts of things, but you do need to get through complicated matters. And many people do not have a lot of skills with decision making. They don't have methods, and they therefore are not very good at decision making. And so, is that always going to be a pertinent fact of life, or can people grow and develop? And that's a good question, because not everybody's the same. So it may be that some people aren't going to grow and develop quite as rapidly as others, or may be resistant to taking advice or seeking it. So in this way, there are different challenges depending on who is being supported in supported decision-making. So in that sense, it doesn't work the same way, because not everybody's the same person. And how many of you would know someone that is not very good at taking advice? You know? And doesn't realize it. And yet there may be others that they are very careful to listen to good advice and take it on. So in that sense, the support people will need will depend on their personality, their nature, their habits, things of that sort. So the supporting of them through support decision-making is going to be a little bit different for each, sort of, because each, according to their strengths and weaknesses, may need a different strategy of support. Also, people may have, comprehension of some matters and very weak comprehension of others. In other words, they're less competent in thinking about some things more than others. And so a very good question is, are they getting support where they really need it? And if they're not, and it doesn't play to their strengths, they're going to be more vulnerable, because they do need support with some things they aren't getting. if you do have the advantage of people around you that you can go to, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work like clockwork, but you typically will be better off in the long run because you've just simply got more you can count on by way of support and a variety of support. And you can change that if it's not enough. You can add support that you didn't have before because you'd say, well, we don't know who would be helpful with this question. It's a new question that's come up. And similarly, the person themselves can change over time in terms of how they go about their business. In other words, if people start having some kind of methods for doing things, for instance, people develop little rules for themselves around decisions like don't make decisions when you're upset. That's a little rule, kind of sensible rule. In other words, another one would be don't make decisions when people are pressuring you. You know, go off and let them go away and make your decision. Or another would be don't make decisions impulsively or in a hurry. Or check with people that are sensible before you make a decision. So any of those would be great rules for people. But many people don't have little rules like that for themselves, so they're more vulnerable. They need to develop rules or practices or whatever. How many of you are good at having the pros and cons of things worked out? On the one hand, on the other hand. Well, that's a method, and it's a very good method. People have been using that method for centuries. Because when you don't have that method, you're not going to be able to kind of manage things in a kind of organized way. All that means is that people can grow and be helped to grow in terms of their capacities to do things. And how many of you are much better at making decisions now than when you were younger?
Yeah.
You're less foolish, less impulsive, this, that. Well, you're living proof, you see, that people can learn. Because you've all nodded that you've learned a great deal. And that is true, that the business of making decisions does benefit from practice. And it does benefit from learning from your mistakes, which would be another good thing, another good practice. When you didn't do a good decision, it's always good to identify how come. Look back and digest it. So we're not stuck in a particular pattern of decision making. We can be stuck, but we don't need to be, because we can just change our ways. So in that sense, you could think of supported decision making as developmental. You can develop.
Yeah.
No matter where you start, you could end up in a quite different place. And again, going back to Corey, one of the things his mother told me was that Corey was much more confident after doing supported decision making for a while. He was much clearer about what mattered to him, and he was feeling more empowered and had a sense of his own authority, which you often see in people that when they begin to succeed with things, they feel quite different about themselves. So in that way, what a person may look like they're a poor candidate for supported decision making, but that's because they're not getting support now. But they might look a little bit different when they get some practice. But to do this, you need to be a bit intentional. The supported decision making, you have to almost be proactive a little bit around decisions and decision making. And particularly if the person's not been in the habit of being proactive. And so getting people to, kind of get organized about a decision or find some way to make a good decision means somebody's got to be a catalyst for that if it doesn't come from the person. So supporters are often in the position where they're trying to encourage people to go one way or another, not to make their decisions for them, but to have a way to kind of think something through. If that's there, then you actually have influence. And influence can be used very positively. There's such a thing as bad influences. of course, but influence is, people can be influenced, let's put it that way, in a good way, and in an ethical way. Because of course, support decision-making, the idea is that the supporters are supposed to be ethical, and not that they necessarily know it, each and every instance, but people typically, sort of the understanding in support decision-making is that the person's going to make the decision, and the supporter shouldn't be making decisions for the person. Though in my life, I have lots of people that are quite happy to make my decisions for me. So I never lack for guidance from, even when I didn't seek it out, you know. It's interesting how that works. So it is quite possible then for people to really be in a different position than where they started, because they've grown a bit, they've changed a few of their habits, that sort of thing, and may have kind of learned something in the process and have a better outcome in their life. Now, supporters can be potentially anybody that the person picks. So often people pick people they know, but they may be in roles that they've encountered them in. So if you had a co-worker, the only reason you're picking them is because you met them at work and you like them and became friends or whatever. So in case of people with disabilities, sometimes it could be friends, relatives, could be people they met through service organizations, service providers that they liked or trusted on some things. So the different roles people play may simply be a way in which a person got acquainted with somebody. And it isn't so much their role that's doing it, it's that they have some confidence in the person because of some kind of encounter with them. And it's also possible, of course, for people to pick supporters that weren't a good pick. And you may take a while to realize that. But how many of us have relied on people that weren't a good pick, but seemed okay at the time, you know? So there are some risks of picking poorly and whatnot, but that's always been true for centuries, so you can't eliminate that. Otherwise, people would have to be perfect, and we cover that in the advanced course, how to be perfect. Because most of us aren't all that perfect. So it goes with the territories. That doesn't mean that support decision-making is invalid because imperfect people do it. It just means it's another thing to keep your eye on. Now, some people don't have many people in their life. They're quite isolated, and in that case, you really have to recruit supporters. They don't really exist at that point. And you can reach out to people that obviously may not even know the person, or may have an acquaintance with the person, but not very close. But at least they may be familiar people to the person. And the person themselves may recruit people, but also friends of the person may recruit people, or allies. So it can come from a number of different sources as to who might come to support the person. Support decision-making then, if it exists, it may be a mechanism through which people are aided in the process of recruiting people. For instance, if you had a supported decision-making program and there were people in the program, they may be able to help you figure out how to find supporters, you know. But it doesn't necessarily have to come from that. It can come from other people that are just as interested and just as good at recruiting people. People often ask, well, which kinds of decisions do you start with? Very simple answer to that is whatever is interesting. People don't really like to start with something that's not interesting, or decisions that are of no interest to them. So it could be as simple as what are you going to do next week? Could be just as important a decision to start with as it is, which job should I apply for? In other words, the practice of decision-making doesn't have to be about important, big, difficult things. It can be just decisions, learning how to make decisions about small things. Like even having an organized way to think about how you spend your money could be as simple as what's the impact if I buy this? And if that's what the person wants to make a decision about, then that's a good place to start. So in that sense, it's not you don't save support decision making for the big, important decisions in life. You may just use it for the ones that are on your mind today, whatever those might be. They could be relatively simple things, but you're still trying to figure them out. Now, informal support decision-making initiatives, there's often what's called a supported decision-making agreement. And what that is a very simple agreement that says, I have picked these people as my supporters, and I may pick different ones for different types of support. And you just sign it, and it often gets notarized as an agreement, and it can't be changed without the person changing. Now, people that agreed to be supporters can stop being supporters. They can say, I'm done with doing support. So it's not that they're bound indefinitely, but the person being supported, the focused person, or sometimes they're called the decision maker, they can also decide against the supporter if it comes to that. And the support decision-making agreement is quite flexible, and as I said, sometimes people get them notarized. It just gives a certain clarity and formality to the role, which makes it a little bit more, people are clearer about their responsibility a little bit, more than they might otherwise be. And you can replace people. People may leave your life for one reason or another. You can, you've relied on them, but they're no longer available, so you can recruit somebody else to take their place. You don't need a supported decision-making agreement. You could still do supported decision-making, but it's often very good when you're getting started with supported decision-making, because it sort of clarifies who's doing what. You can update the agreement anyway, so even if people change what they're doing and so on, it's easy enough to change the agreement. It's also something you can share if you want to. You can share it with other people. These are the people that help me, and these are the things they help me with. So in that sense, it's a way of communicating who your allies are and on what the subject. And it also makes the role for the person that's doing the support a little bit clearer. It almost, in a sense, puts them on notice that this is what you've agreed to. So in that sense, it can help build a certain amount of accountability. And the agreement doesn't allow other people to make your decisions for you. That's definitely not part of it. And it doesn't mean that you can go to people, that you can't go to other people who aren't in the agreement, because you always talk to somebody else. You don't need an agreement to do that. You just may find yourself talking with somebody else without really having anticipated it or planned it. And the person might still not be part of the agreement, but you still have them as an additional informal supporter. You don't need legislation to have an agreement like this. It's a totally voluntary arrangement. Now, they do in laws where there are laws supporting support decision-making, they will often refer to support decision-making agreements and what should be in them. But that's where a law exists. But not the actual people that should be in it, but what the form should take. Now, if people had a perfect track record in making decisions, that would be very unusual. And so the premise that people wouldn't benefit from support decision-making because they might still make poor decisions is probably incorrect. That even with support, you could make poor decisions. And so the idea of support decision-making isn't that it's foolproof, that it guarantees that people will make great decisions. It just simply increases the likelihood that people will make better decisions, but nobody is sort of made perfect by getting support. So support doesn't, it helps you and you can improve, but doesn't mean that you're going to be betting 100% on all decisions. And so in that sense, it's too high a standard that you have to, you can't make it. The support decision-making has failed you if you make a poor decision. When in fact, you just got to drive on any road on any day, and you'll find all kinds of drivers making very poor decisions who still have their license the next day. And yet, so if you could think of it as a metaphor, even good drivers make mistakes and should keep their license, but there's still a hazard nonetheless. So support decision-making in this sense is a support, it's not a panacea. It doesn't inoculate people from poor judgments that they may make at any given moment. There is this term, the least restrictive principle. It's a term that's used a lot, but what it really means is that the arrangement is the least restrictive as possible, so that the person is not, has the maximum amount of freedom and least amount of restrictiveness in their life. And this is an issue for many people with disabilities who grow up being overprotected, over-supervised in many ways, so they don't really learn as quickly under those circumstances of how to manage things well themselves because they're being so managed by other people. So that might be very protective of them on one level, but on another level it takes away from their ability to grow into being more responsible and more competent themselves with decision making. So it's sort of what often is referred to as learned helplessness. That people can learn to look to others to be guided rather than to look to themselves and for some kind of direction in their life. And so having an agreement doesn't mean that you're incompetent. All it means is that you're competent enough to realize I could benefit from having good advice and good support. And it doesn't mean that the person has given up their rights voluntarily. It's simply people finding a smart way to get supported. And it doesn't mean that they couldn't make decisions without the supporters. They can probably make a lot of decisions because there are thousands of decisions we make in a week, but we wouldn't be worried about a lot of those decisions. But some that were on our mind that were complicated, we might seek support. So in that sense, support is becomes more important if the decision is particularly challenging or you need to make a decision relatively soon or something. And it doesn't mean that the supporters are good supporters. They may be good on some days, not so good on other days. So in that sense, supporters can drop the ball. Doesn't mean that they're invalid. It just means that they have good days, bad days, and that a particular decision may not play to their strengths. It's also true that sometimes the advice we get from a supporter might be actually disagreement with us. So supporters aren't necessarily making a decision, but they may be pointing out that they think the decision should be X or Y, and for this reason. So in that sense, the supporters can disagree with the decision maker, but that's not the same as imposing their view on the decision maker. But how many of you have given advice to people that didn't want it, didn't like your advice? But if it's done respectfully, at least people can, they know what the advice was, and it either is dismissed or not dismissed. And it's always possible to make a decision without your supporter, if you feel like it. So supporters aren't necessarily have a right to be in on every decision. They exist at the pleasure of the person and what they see as the important things. Yeah, so the first point there is that the agreement is really the person's agreement. They have the final say on it, but people could give input as to what kinds of support should be there. And the agreements don't obligate other people. So it's a voluntary relationship. People are choosing to be a supporter. They've been chosen to be a supporter by the person. So they're doing it voluntarily of their own free will, and in that sense, they don't have other obligations other than what you've given voluntarily in terms of what you said you would do. And it doesn't authorize other people to make decisions for you. There's other kinds of means for that. It doesn't mean, though, that people are entirely clear what their role is and what kind of support is needed. But it's the basis of the beginning of trying to figure that out. And the support decision-making agreement, because we've had very few laws on support decision-making, at this point, the legislative recognition is relatively limited at the moment in the U.S., but that will probably change. There's quite a few states working on statutes, so we'll see quite a variety of different ways this plays out, but that's a little bit ahead of us at the moment. What we will see, though, I think, is a preventive measure that might move the statistics in terms of who's getting guardianship and who's maintaining their rights. In other words, over time, this should slow down the numbers of guardianships and increase the number of people that are holding on to their ability to make their own decisions. And that will have a significant impact, because not just for the individual, but it may begin to shift the attitude that people with disabilities can be responsible decision makers and they have competency and things like that, because there is at this stage in our history quite prejudicial assumptions about people with disabilities. And they're generally, people with disabilities are generally underestimated in terms of their true potentials and competencies. So this should shift that a little bit in the other direction. So if you could think of it as support decision-making as capacity building, then it's a practice that increases the person's capacity. to do things and to make decisions and to carry themselves in different ways they go through the world. So in that sense, people may have the innate capacity to do it, but they've never had the role or the opportunity to show their capacities. And so in this sense, it sort of like opens a door to strengthen the person's capacities. And it's always interesting to me just how many people are underestimated in terms of what they can actually do for themselves and their true capacities. You just think of the numbers of people with disabilities today that are working at regular jobs in the community that were seen as never going to be able to work in their life. You see an example of that underestimation. Now there are states in the U.S. where 75 to 80% of people with disabilities are working at least 18 hours a week with regular wages. So that's quite a change from even a generation ago. But it shows that there is greater capacity in people with disabilities than there was a way to kind of grow those capacities. That doesn't mean, though, that people stop having limitations. Everybody will live with their limitations. And even with supported decision-making, people still have limitations. And those limitations will have consequences. So people find support to work around limitations. For instance, if someone can't read for whatever reason, they're going to need support by having somebody else read things for them. So they overcome their lack of literacy by some kind of support. So limitations aren't a reason to lose your rights. They're just a reason to get support. How many of you wouldn't think that you're very good at understanding some topics? Yeah. And that's because you don't understand some topics. And how many of you are still not understanding them after trying for many years to understand them? So it doesn't mean you haven't made progress, but you have limits. That's all it means. So on many subjects, people they don't have a head for it, so to speak, or it's not their thing, or they can't make head nor tail of it, and so on. So even in the context of limitations, people can sort of manage. Yeah, so that first long sentence there really is kind of reiterates that people can move from where they are right now to an improved kind of situation if the support is there. So there's always that. It's also true, too, that people may lose competencies due to other reasons in their life. And so a supported decision may help them adjust to some loss of capacity or loss of competency because they have support. Whereas if you didn't have the support, you'd lose the capacity, but you can compensate for losing some capacity. For instance, if you gradually were losing your eyesight, which is a capacity, you can get support to work around increasing vision loss. But if you didn't have a way to do that, then the vision loss would have a bigger impact. It would just interfere with a lot more things. So you can kind of see it play out that way. And at the level of the role, people supported decision-making really highlights that this is a person who's a decider, a person that's going to make decisions. And so the role is strengthened. Okay. Yep, that's it.
That's it? That's what? That's what I want to do?
So I've been thinking throughout this that it's almost, to me, the important work would be to work with the identified supporter. So if Johnny wanted Uncle Sam to support him around money, and then Johnny wanted Auntie Nancy to support him around shopping and picking out curtains and figuring out household stuff, that it's really important to work with those two individuals around not giving their best advice and getting mad if Johnny doesn't follow it. You know, it's almost like really, really important to broker them to a role that is best seasoned advice without the baggage of, well, then don't ask me if you don't want my advice. You know what I mean? I feel like the more work needs to go into that up front anyway. Moreover than the individual, because they'll figure it out over time, but if the person coming in to support that role, they really need to have a kind of a well understood formulation about what their role is going to be, you know?
Yeah, no, that's true, and like who orients that person?
Yeah.
Who gives them their sort of guidance and whatnot? And otherwise you're just dumping people with no preparation into a role that they may actually not be very suited for.
And if they really love Johnny, they're going to be passionate about their supporting help, you know, and and maybe really want it to go good, you know, in a way that isn't as constricted. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. That's going to be a constant challenge because people are not necessarily all that suited to everything they choose to do.
Right.
And they may still be doing some good, but they still may, at the same time, be creating all kinds of problems because of the way they go at it or things like that, or even their sort of natural personality may be bossy, for instance.
And these resources, is there anything about what a someone who's supporting an individual, what are good things to keep in mind? I mean, I feel like this presentation covered it, but also.
Well, there are, in some of those, it does touch on those questions, but there's none of those resources explicitly deal with that particular challenge. I have some of my own writings. I worked out the principles that should guide supporters, and there would be similar things that have been written in short form that you can get. But I think the sort of the ethics and the practices of supporters, you could take it to a quite more complicated level that you wouldn't. But you would. It would, if we did have that, then you could do things like orient people, give them training or guidance or things to read that say that. And that would be a very good support to supporters.
Yeah.
You know, even videos that sort of said the same thing. So just even some simple do's and don'ts would be very helpful. Because a lot of people just are kind of clueless on many of these things. They don't realize that they're not being helpful.
Yeah.
But if they had a little bit of a heads up, then they'll remember, oh, I was told not to do this. For instance, many people want to make the thing about decision making when it's really a relationship.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to plunge into content without having a relationship, that's, you should get the relationship in good order and then go from there and give it time, particularly with strangers that don't know each other. And that seems sensible, but people forget that. They get so interested in doing.
Yeah.
They get ahead of the relationship.
How do you see the process evolving, especially at the beginning? Who asks the supporters to make sure they're being involved? In other words, if the individual doesn't have a lot of initiative, if someone asks that individual a question to make a decision, they make that. If they don't have a guardian and don't have a supported decision-making document, they still make the decision. Who says, oh, what about the supporters? Have you asked anyone? Does there still need to be like a lead person, especially at the beginning?
I think at the beginning in particular, because there's got to be somebody to kind of oversee the whole putting it into place. I mean, it won't be just at the beginning. I think it'd be much better if somebody was looking over shoulders. But you have to figure out how that gets done. Because not everybody's in the person's life enough to know how everything kind of connects. So often it'll be somebody who knows them really well that sees some of this. Particularly if they see the person often, they can see the kind of cause and effect between what somebody did and what the reaction was of the person, the fallout really. So who's monitoring it, in other words, and who's, again, if you had a project, then you could use that for some of that, but you could also do a lot more training of people and therefore orient them better, and have some of these issues get discussed. So there's consciousness raising, and if there were people that saw as part of their role to monitor things, that could also be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. And the states that have done legislation, is that primarily aimed at cases in which an individual, like a doctor or an institution, might not think someone has the capacity to make a decision and won't accept the decision? And the legislation is to say, there's a supported decision-making process, so they have to, is that the primary?
Well, it helps, but it's not a panacea because professionals often will just ignore the support decision-making and say, well, I don't care. This person's incompetent, and I don't believe he or she should be making decisions. It happens every day.
Mm-hmm.
That they may do it for different reasons. Sometimes they think they may be being helpful, but it could also be that they are worried about liability.
Mm-hmm.
That if I do something to cooperate with the person's wishes, and something goes wrong, then am I, as a professional, liable for any of the sequence of things? And the answer to that is, well, even with support decision-making, the professional is still liable. In other words, if they, whether they're doing it with or without the person's consent, whatever they are doing professionally, they're still liable for it. So it's not that ignoring the person's wishes is going to mean that they're not going to have to live with liabilities. Doctors still have to do doctoring that's good, or whatever the role is that the person's in. But it doesn't really matter. What the issue there isn't that they've done anything about their liability. What they've done is they've now undermined that person, and in the name of protecting their own liability. But now the person's being ignored, their wishes are being ignored, and that has consequences. For instance, we're working on some training for healthcare professionals to basically treat people with disabilities as decision makers. And there is interest from some healthcare professionals, but the reason it's needed is there isn't necessarily interest in the part of many healthcare professionals into listening to the person and taking them as seriously as decision makers. So we've got to kind of reach out to, particularly to younger professionals, and train them so they have a bit of a mind shift on this sort of thing. And that'll be a generation's work, really.
But my question is, what would you say has held, especially in the U.S., has held U.S. back from adopting this model? Because other countries, especially those countries that have ratified convention on the rights of people with disability, have gone. They may not have gone on full blown on this, but they have gone some steps. Countries like Canada and all that. What has held the U.S. behind?
Well, the reason the U.S. doesn't sign treaties as much as other countries is it's a kind of peculiarity of just the American, you know, culture really, that the country doesn't like to have international obligations unless it suits them. They want to be only answerable to Americans. They don't want to be answerable to international bodies. So that's been particularly in certain element of American public life. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And of course, the Americans like to have their own way of doing things as well. And in the United States, that really has meant that the support decision-making isn't going to really come from an international source. It's going to come from within the country. And that is exactly what's happening, that it's bubbling up out of interest. People have heard of support decision-making. Many groups, as I pointed out, have adopted it and trying to make some progress with it. So, and that's been a way of so many things happening in the United States, is it'll start in 1 or 2 states. You go back 10 years later, 25 states are doing something. So it's a gradual adoption of practices, and I think we'll see that. Even with support decision-making, we've seen it because, first of all, people didn't know what it was, and now people are being familiarized with it, which is increasing the interest in support decision-making, which is then increases the activity and the structure around support decision-making. So we do have states that do have laws, for instance. We have pilot projects. We have more publications on it. We've got more parents that know about it. We've got more professionals. So it's a kind of bottom-up way of operating. And at some point, when national bodies see that, then the national bodies adopt it. And it goes further. And I've mentioned some of the national organizations that have essentially come out in favor of support decision-making. And that's been pretty typical for so many things in the United States, is that it tends to be much more a shift in, almost a shift in culture around the way we do things, you know? And of course, we're still influenced, even though Americans don't sign as many treaties. It's not like there's a big wall that things can't go through. So ideas come from other countries, and we adopt them here, just like stuff comes from America and it's adopted somewhere else. So in that sense, Americans are different from the American government. And if Americans find something interesting somewhere, they just bring it home.
Yeah.
Even though there's always an effort to put up walls, make support decision-making great again, but really, it's more people making the case for something and being persuasive, and gradually, then things shift, and that's influenced heavily by social movements. And of course, we have a very strong disability movement in the United States and other related social movements. And what those are people pulling in the same direction, but in thousands of different little ways. And they're collectively a movement, but at an individual level, it's just one person thinking a little bit differently, behaving a little bit differently, and so on. And of course, support decision-making is very consistent with, for instance, person-centered practice. Doing things one person at a time, because it's all about the person and their life and their decisions. And so culturally, it's not that a big jump from person-centered practice and services to person-centered decision-making. They're very complementary. And the issue of rights is being supported in so many other ways. We've got all kinds of concern about the rights of people with disabilities in many, many ways, and many pieces of legislation already. So it's not really a big jump to support decision-making. So I think that's why I think we'll see in a generation from now, it'll just be another part of the backdrop, because it won't be unfamiliar to people, and it'll have been tried with a lot more people than we have done it with now. so people will be a lot more seasoned and experienced with the support decision-making. Some of these questions that you've been asking about what would be supports that would be good to have in place to make the whole process go better. I think we'll be much further along on that. At this point, we don't have much by way of support to people, so they're out there with you got a job to do, but not a whole lot of resources to draw upon. And we can manage that, but I think there will be more to draw upon in time. I mean, I can think of what my workload's going to look like over the next 10 years in terms of the missing pieces that I think I should work on and put in place. But they used to have these things called frequently asked questions about support decision making. Except when I go to write them, I find that there's another 500 questions that they lead to. So it's almost like you'd have like 1,000 of the most familiar questions about support decision making. But you should think about them. So I think we'll be further along, and I think some of those pieces will be developed and in place, and will make it a lot easier for a lot of people. We may even have supported decision making in the movie. So who's going to be the stars in the movie, you know? So yeah, I think a lot of that will come with time. I think we're still a little bit early days. In fact, I know we are early days because there are more support decision-making pilots in Massachusetts than there is anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
We don't even have a law. You know, other states have started with much more with things like policies and various kinds of training programs and things like that. So we just haven't started with pilot projects.
Another question. Just been thinking about the word incompetent. When somebody is declared incompetent, as you said, he loses your personhood, essentially. Will support the decision making, because nobody is incompetent in all areas of their lives. So will it essentially kind of remove that kind of way of declaring people incompetent? Because I can make few decisions about what we are today. I can be competent in that, but I may not be able to do a legal paper. So
Well, I think when people are declared incompetent, it can be done legally, and at that point, guardians will be appointed. But people could be declared incompetent with no legal basis for it, and be just treated like they're incompetent. Because somebody in authority just says this person isn't competent. And that was very common with people with disabilities. Even today it's common enough that people will just treat people like they're not competent, and they almost in effect lose their rights and the right to be respected. So some of that's more of an attitude or a belief or an assumption of incompetence. It's probably based really on prejudice of some sort, but I think that's very real, and I think it's part of our culture, and I think we'll struggle with that for a good long time going into the future. Even if nobody's declared legally competent, people will still tend to treat people as if they're not competent. Again, based on prejudice. It's now prejudice can be changed. You can change it, but it usually takes a while because people's beliefs are just simply entrenched. People can't do this or can't do that. And again, there was a time when we didn't think people could be as independent as they are today. And so we were very wrong back when we thought people couldn't be independent. And we now see people living much more independently and successfully. So what's shifted is really our beliefs about people. And they can be changed, but it's, you know, it takes a while to shift mindsets, and especially if they're entrenched beliefs. It wouldn't be just disabled people. Lots of people experience the very same thing, you know. Prejudices of one kind or another.
So, for, like, if a person has a guardianship, it protects them from some of the vulnerable areas where they can be exploited and all of that. If we go with this agreement, how does this protect them in such areas? For example, your example of buying a car, right? So let's say the supporters help them to make a decision on that, and the car dealer could still sell the car to this person, right? So how does that protect them? Either the agreement makes it much more.
Well, it's, I mean, there's still gonna be people that will exploit people. So it doesn't really, in fact, you have supported decision-making support in place may not mean that people can't still victimize somebody. So it doesn't guarantee that at all. It just means that there's less likelihood of it if the person learns to make decisions and not, for instance, be talked into buying something they can't afford or signing a contract or whatever. But it's the truth of the fact is that there are always people manipulative enough to take advantage of people and work around whatever the system is. So the only real way to avoid that is to have people not be making those decisions without checking with people that they trust. But again, that's not always possible. The other thing is you can have laws that protect people from that kind of manipulation, and we do have laws like that in some instances. So a combination of personal support, some laws that protect people, and then when you go back to guardianship, if the person is under guardianship and somebody has sold them something, then they're going to be in a tough spot because the person may not have the legal right to agree to a contract, even to purchase the car. If they signed a purchase agreement and they have no legal right to sign purchase agreements, the agreement's not valid. So that's where guardianship is helpful, because you can go back to that person, that salesperson, and say, well, you manipulated this person who has no authority to sign that kind of contract. And that is a good feature of guardianship. But again, it's even with guardianship, you still have people being ripped off in new and wonderful ways that nobody ever saw it coming. So again, you don't want to oversell guardianship as the kind of wonderful, kind of protector of people. In fact, many guardians are themselves not very good at that sort of thing. And what your guardian signs may be much more of a worry than what the person signs, because the guardian may not be good with money either. So you just don't want to put supported decision making on a pedestal, and you don't want to put guardianship on a pedestal. People are still vulnerable, no matter. That's the world we live in. But you're just less vulnerable if you got people in your corner and you develop good habits to keep yourself out of trouble. But even then, people do get taken advantage of. Nobody wants to hear that. Of course, we'd all like a better world, but that could take weeks, I think another thing is that's very interesting is to me is more the developmental question, like what happens if you start practicing supported decision making with young people with disabilities? And they got a lot of practice from being very young about how to be organized about their decision making. They'd hit their teen years in a much better shape than any of us did, you know. So in that sense, there is the educational benefits of thoughtful support can equip people so that they're better able to manage themselves, rather than waiting to support people, you know, when they're adults. A lot of this is your identity is formed when you're much younger, and so some of this can be done in other ways. It may not even need support decision making, but it can make people much more ready for the adult world than they are. And first of all, you can make people less naive. You know, that's teachable.
Yeah.
You can make people develop good habits that are self-protecting. You can, you know, a very good habit would be if you've got somebody to go to when something doesn't seem right, you know, and that there's, you know, people's alarm bells go off, and they know when I hear those alarms, I go talk to them. So some of that is very strengthening of people. It doesn't have to be done in supported decision making. You just need a vision for the fact that people's capacities could be strengthened, particularly if you start young. You know, people can be much more proactive and responsible and competent. I remember I was working in Australia, and I met this young man with autism. He was about 16 at the time, maybe 17. And his mother was from Taiwan. She was a single parent. I think quite affluent from the look of the place they lived in. And she was one of these Asian tiger mothers, as they would call her, you know. And she had enormously high expectations for her son. And her son was unbelievably competent. There was nothing in that house that he couldn't manage. And the reason he was able to manage it was the expectation was right from day one, he's going to manage all these things. And this guy's going to make some great husband for somebody because he's so competent, you know. And but you wonder what would have happened to him with a different mother. Would you have seen all that competence? Because there'd be no calling for it, you know.
Yeah.
So I think this is the part of the developmental aspect of things, that people can grow and develop if there's cause to, and if there's a catalyst of some sort, or number of them. So and you know, so starting young has its advantages. Of course, there's the old joke, when I was 16, my father knew nothing. When I was 21, I was surprised how much he'd learned in 5 years.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, a couple just the final things then. You can always reach us at the Center for Public Representation if you're interested in support decision making or follow up or something, even if it's, you know, months or years from now, that's fine. So we'd like you to know that we're a resource, and you should be bothering us if you get something. There are a fair number of trainings around support decision making. This was more like an introduction, but there are trainings on other subject matter. As I pointed out, there's quite a lot of written and video and other kinds of sources for things, so you will find them if you go looking for them. And increasingly we have people that have practiced supported decision making, and they're often quite able to be reached and so on. And of course we'll have more of those people as more people try it out. So there will be a lot more resources in time if you do find you're still interested and you want to get curious about something. Just to follow up, we may know of a resource that you don't know about yet, but you may find it on your own. I mean, it's just it's amazing what you can find on Mr. Google, you know? So I still keep finding things. So Well, thanks for coming out on this
Yes,
lovely
thank you.
winter's
Thank you.
evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And